Genesis 1 is the beginning of everything, literally, but it's not a story of cosmic chaos or warring gods like the other ancient myths. It's a story of a God who creates with intention, with a word. He brings light out of darkness, order out of emptiness, and beauty out of nothing. Day by day, creation unfolds like a masterpiece. Sky and sea, land and life, stars and seasons. Everything is shaped with purpose. Everything is declared good. And at the center of it all, humanity is made in God's image, not as slaves to the divine, but as partners in His world, reflecting His character and entrusted with His creation. Genesis 1 isn't just the first page of the Bible, it's the foundation of everything the Bible wants us to know about God. He's powerful, He's purposeful, and He's good. Creation tells us that the world isn't an accident, and neither are we. Now Genesis 2 zooms in from the cosmic to the personal. Instead of speaking creation from a distance, God forms humanity with His own hands and breathes life into dust. It's intimate, intentional, and relational, showing that humans aren't just part of creation, they're its centerpiece. God plants a garden in Eden, a place bursting with life, beauty, and provision, and He places the man there not just to enjoy it, but to work it and guard it. Vocation isn't a curse, it's part of the design, and God sees that the man shouldn't be alone, so He creates woman, not as an afterthought, but as a perfect counterpart, equal in worth and joined to Him in a covenant bond. Together they form the first marriage, a union marked by unity, trust, and harmony. Genesis 2 shows us that life with God was meant to be personal, purposeful, and shared. Before the fall, before the brokenness, this is what humanity was meant to be. Rooted in God's presence, working His world, and walking in relationship with one another. Genesis 3 is the turning point of the entire biblical story. In a garden overflowing with freedom, beauty, and trust, a serpent speaks a lie that twists God's words and questions His goodness. Instead of resisting, Adam and Eve listen, they reach, they take, and in that moment, something breaks. Innocence disappears, shame enters. They hide from the very God who formed them, and the consequences ripple outward. Pain, conflict, toil, and death become part of human experience. But even as God announces judgment, He also plants a seed of hope, a promise that one day a descendant of the woman will crush the serpent's head, even though it will cost him dearly. Genesis 3 isn't just the story of sin entering the world. It's the story of grace entering right alongside it. Humanity falls, but God refuses to abandon His creation. The rest of the Bible unfolds from this moment, pointing forward to the Redeemer who will undo what was broken in the garden. Genesis 4 shows how quickly sin grows once it enters the world. Cain and Abel both bring offerings to God, but what starts as worship turns into resentment. God warns Cain that sin is crouching at the door, waiting to master him. But Cain ignores the warning. In the first field outside Eden, the first murder takes place. A brother rises against his brother. When God confronts him, Cain hides behind defiance. Am I my brother's keeper? Revealing just how deeply sin fractures relationships. Yet even in judgment, God shows mercy. Cain is sent away, but not abandoned. God marks him for protection, so his life won't be taken. The chapter ends with two diverging legacies. Cain's line builds cities and culture, but grows increasingly corrupt, while Adam and Eve have another son, Seth, through whom people begin to call on the name of the Lord again. Genesis 4 reminds us that sin doesn't stay small. It spreads, destroys, and divides, but even in humanity's darkest moments, God keeps preserving a line of hope. Genesis 5 looks like a simple genealogy, but it carries a heavy message. The world outside Eden is marked by death. Generation after generation, the pattern repeats. They lived, they had sons and daughters, and then they died. It's the echo of the curse from Genesis 3, spreading through the human story. But in the middle of this long march of mortality, one name breaks the rhythm: Enoch. He was one of Adam's descendants, known not for what he built or achieved, but for how he lived. He walked with God. Instead of saying, "and he died," the chapter says, Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. It's a quiet but powerful reminder that even in a world overshadowed by death, intimacy with God is still possible. The genealogy ends by introducing Noah, a hint that God is already preparing a way forward. Genesis 5 may read like a record of endings, but tucked inside is a spark of hope, a sign that God's presence can interrupt even the darkest patterns. Genesis 6 reveals just how far humanity has drifted from the goodness of Eden. The world is now saturated with corruption, violence, exploitation, and hearts bent away from everything God intended. What God made good has been twisted, and the chapter makes it clear. This isn't just a few people doing wrong, it's a complete moral collapse. It grieves God, not because he's surprised, but because he cares deeply about his creation. And in all that darkness, one man stands out, Noah. He's not flawless, but he's faithful. Someone who walks with God when almost no one else does. So God reveals his plan to stop the spread of evil through a great flood, not to wipe out hope, but to protect it. Noah becomes the vessel for a new beginning. Genesis 6 is heavy, but it also shows the heart of God. Even when the world is broken beyond repair, he still seeks out those who listen to him, and through them he keeps his purpose alive. Now, Genesis 7 is where the warning becomes reality. After giving Noah time to prepare, God tells him to enter the ark with his family and the animals, because the flood is about to begin, and when the doors close, the world they knew closes with them. Rain pours from the sky, waters burst from the earth, and the boundaries God once set between land and sea collapse. What follows is a picture of judgment, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Evil had spread so deeply that the world needed to be reset. The floodwaters rise above mountains, covering everything, and every living thing outside the ark is swept away. It's devastating, and the chapter doesn't soften that reality. But inside the ark, carried safely on the water, Noah and his family remain under God's protection. Genesis 7 shows both sides of God's character, his justice against a world consumed by violence, and his mercy in preserving a future through one faithful family. Genesis 8 shifts from judgment to renewal. After months of silence and endless water, God remembers Noah, not because he ever forgot him, but to show that compassion is at the center of this story. The flood begins to retreat as God sends a wind over the earth, restoring the order that had collapsed bit by bit. Mountains reappear. Noah waits, releases birds, and watches for signs of life returning. When the dove finally comes back with an olive leaf, it's a small symbol with a massive meaning. The world is healing. Once the earth is dry, Noah steps out into a quieter, emptier world, and his first act isn't rebuilding, it's worship. He offers a sacrifice to God, acknowledging that survival was a gift, not an achievement. And God responds with a promise. Never again will he destroy all life like this. Even though human hearts still struggle with sin, Genesis 8 shows that judgment is not God's final word. Renewal is. From devastation comes a fresh start, and from Noah's simple act of worship comes a new chapter for humanity. Genesis 9 marks the beginning of life after the flood, a fresh world and a fresh promise. God blesses Noah and his family and renews the original calling from Eden. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. But this time, God adds something new, a covenant. He promises never again to destroy the world with a flood, and he gives a sign so humanity will never doubt it. The rainbow. It's not just a pretty sky moment, it's a reminder of God's mercy, a visible symbol that judgment won't be the final chapter of humanity's story. Yet even with a clean slate, human brokenness doesn't disappear. The episode with Noah's drunkenness and his sons shows that sin survived the flood because it lives in the human heart. Genesis 9 is a mix of grace and realism. God commits himself to creation with a promise of protection, but the chapter also reminds us that the world's biggest problem isn't the environment around us, it's the condition within us. Genesis 10 is often called the Table of Nations, and it shows how the world begins to rebuild after the flood. The families of Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, spread out across the earth, becoming the roots of future peoples, cultures, and regions. What starts as a single family grows into entire civilizations, each with their own lands, languages, and identities. It's not a list for the sake of listing, it's the Bible's way of showing how connected humanity is. Every tribe and nation traces back to the same starting point. Genesis 10 also hints at how diverse the world will become. While still emphasizing that all people share the same creator and the same story, it's the calm before the next disruption. The moment when human families multiply, spread, and begin forming the world map we recognize today. Genesis 11 shows what happens when humanity's unity is driven by pride instead of purpose. As people settle together, they decide to build a massive tower, a monument to their own greatness. Let's make a name for ourselves, they say. It's not about architecture, it's about ambition. Instead of filling the earth as God commanded, they try to gather in one place and climb their way to significance. So God steps in, not to punish creativity, but to stop pride from consuming them. He confuses their language, scattering them across the world and forming the roots of different cultures and people groups. The Tower of Babel becomes a symbol of how pride divides. But the chapter doesn't end with confusion. It ends with hope. a genealogy leads to a man named Abram, hinting that God is about to start a new story through one family. Genesis 11 shows that even when humanity tries to build its own path to greatness, God redirects the story toward his plan, and his plan begins with a promise to Abram. Genesis 12 is the moment the story narrows from the whole world to one man. God calls Abram, an ordinary man from an ordinary family, and tells him to leave everything familiar: his country, his culture, his security. In return, God promises something far greater. He will give Abram a land, make his descendants into a great nation, and bless all the families of the earth through him. It's the beginning of a plan that reaches far beyond Abram's lifetime. Abram doesn't get all the details, but he responds with trust. He goes where God leads, arriving in the land of Canaan, where God confirms the promise again. But the chapter also shows Abram's humanity. A famine drives him to Egypt, fear leads him to make mistakes, and yet God protects him anyway. Genesis 12 marks a turning point in the Bible. God's rescue mission for the world begins not with a king or a nation, but with a single step of faith from a man named Abram. Genesis 13 shows how Abram handles conflict with wisdom and generosity. As Abram and his nephew Lot grow wealthy, their herdsmen start competing for space. Instead of letting tension divide the family, Abram offers Lot the first choice of the land, an act of humility that puts peace over pride. Lot chooses the lush, well-watered plains near Sodom, while Abram stays in the hill country. It looks like Lot got the better deal, but God steps in and renews his promise to Abram. From the high places of Canaan, God tells him to look in every direction, north, south, east, and west, and assures him that all this land will one day belong to his descendants. Abram then builds another altar, marking his trust in God's plan. Genesis 13 shows that faith isn't just believing God's promises, it's living with open hands, choosing peace, and trusting that God will provide what truly matters. Genesis 14 feels like a sudden shift into an ancient action scene. A coalition of kings goes to war, cities are captured, and Lot, living near Sodom, is swept up in the chaos and taken prisoner. When Abram hears the news, he doesn't hesitate. He gathers a small force, pursues the invading armies, and rescues Lot along with everyone else who was taken. It's a moment that shows Abram isn't just a man of faith. He's a man of courage and loyalty. But the chapter's most surprising moment comes afterward. As Abram returns, he's met by Melchizedek, a mysterious figure described as both a king and a priest. He blesses Abram in the name of God Most High and receives an offering from him. Melchizedek appears quietly, but his presence hints at a deeper spiritual storyline. A priest-king who honors God long before Israel exists. Genesis 14 ends with Abram refusing the riches of a corrupt king, choosing integrity over reward. It's a chapter that blends rescue, worship, and character, showing that Abram's life is guided not by fear or greed, but by trust in God. Genesis 15 is one of the most important moments in Abram's story. Even though God has promised him countless descendants, Abram still has no child, and he's honest about his doubts. He brings his questions to God, and instead of rebuking him, God leads him outside and tells him to look at the stars. That's how many your descendants will be. In that moment, Abram believes God, and the Bible says this faith is credited to him as righteousness, not because he earned anything, but because he trusted the one who made the promise. Then God does something powerful and symbolic. He formalizes the covenant. In Abram's culture, this kind of ceremony meant that whoever broke the agreement would face the consequences. But instead of Abram walking through the pieces, God alone passes through in a vision, showing that the promise depends entirely on him. Genesis 15 reveals a God who not only makes promises, but binds himself to them. It's a chapter where fear is met with reassurance, doubt is met with truth, and faith becomes the foundation of Abram's relationship with God. Genesis 16 shows what happens when impatience tries to solve what only God can fulfill. Abram and Sarai have heard God's promise of a child, but years have passed with no sign of it coming true. So Sarai proposes a solution common in their culture, but rooted in desperation. She tells Abram to have a child through her servant Hagar. It seems practical, but it creates deep pain. Hagar becomes pregnant, tensions rise, and mistreatment pushes her into the wilderness. But the most surprising moment in the chapter happens out in that wilderness. God meets Hagar. Not Abram, not Sarai, but a mistreated servant girl on the run. He speaks to her, comforts her, and gives her a future for her son. Ishmael Hagar becomes the first person in the Bible to give God a name, the God who sees me. Genesis 16 reminds us that human shortcuts can complicate God's plans, but God never abandons the people caught in the fallout. Even in the mess, he sees, he hears, and he responds with compassion. Genesis 17 is where God deepens his promise and gives it a physical sign. Abram is 99 years old when God appears to him again, reminding him of the covenant and expanding it even further. This time, God gives Abram a new name, Abraham, meaning father of many, because God's promise is bigger than just one child. It's a future filled with nations, kings, and a lasting people. To mark this covenant, God introduces circumcision as a sign of belonging, a reminder that this family is set apart for his purposes, and God doesn't stop there. Sarai receives a new name too, Sarah, and God promises that she, not someone else, will give birth to the long-awaited son. Abraham laughs, not out of disbelief, but out of amazement, because the promise now feels impossibly good. Yet God affirms it. The child of promise will come through Sarah, and his name will be Isaac. Genesis 17 shows God's commitment in a powerful way. He not only declares his promise, he marks his people with a sign and writes their future into their very names. Genesis 18 blends hospitality, promise, and compassion into one powerful scene. 3 mysterious visitors come to Abraham's tent, and he rushes to welcome them with generous care, offering water, rest, and a feast. As they sit together, one of them, speaking with the authority of God, tells Abraham that Sarah will finally have a son within a year. Sarah overhears and laughs quietly, not out of joy, but disbelief. She's far beyond childbearing age, and the promise sounds impossible. But God responds with a question that carries both challenge and comfort. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Then, the focus shifts to a different situation. God reveals that the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are filled with injustice and deep corruption. Instead of accepting judgment without question, Abraham steps forward and intercedes, pleading for God to spare the cities if righteous people can be found there. It's a moment that reveals his growing heart for others and his trust in God's justice. Genesis 18 shows a God who keeps impossible promises and listens when his people pray, even about the darkest places in the world. Genesis 19 is one of the Bible's starkest contrasts between corruption and mercy. The 2 angels who visited Abraham now arrive in Sodom, where Lot, Abraham's nephew, welcomes them into his home. But the city's deep moral decay becomes immediately clear. Violence, exploitation, and disregard for human dignity have taken over. Confirming the outcry God spoke of in the previous chapter, the angels warn Lot that judgment is coming, urging him to gather his family and flee. Even then, hesitation and confusion slow them down, and the angels literally take Lot by the hand to pull him to safety. As Lot and his daughters escape to the hills, God's judgment falls on Sodom and Gomorrah, turning the cities to ashes. Lot's wife looks back longingly and doesn't survive. Another reminder of how deeply the city's influence had taken root. The chapter ends with a troubling episode involving Lot's daughters, showing that even rescue doesn't erase the effects of a broken world. Genesis 19 reveals both the seriousness of injustice and the persistence of God's mercy. He rescues not because people earn it, but because he remembers his promises. Genesis 20 shows that even people of great faith can repeat old mistakes. While living in the region of Gerar, Abraham once again tells others that Sarah is his sister. Afraid that someone might kill him to take her, King Abimelech takes Sarah into his household, unaware of the truth. But before anything can happen, God steps in. He appears to Abimelech in a dream, revealing who Sarah really is and warning him not to touch her. Shocked and innocent, Abimelech confronts Abraham, who admits his fear-driven decision. Instead of letting human failure derail his promise, God protects Sarah and preserves the future he has planned for Abraham's family. Abimelech returns Sarah, blesses Abraham, and even asks him to pray for his household. Genesis 20 reminds us that God's faithfulness doesn't depend on human perfection. Even when Abraham's choices create danger, God intervenes to safeguard the covenant line through which his promises will unfold. Genesis 21 brings long-awaited joy and unexpected sorrow. After decades of waiting, hoping, and even doubting, Sarah finally gives birth to Isaac, the son God promised. The child through whom the covenant will continue his name means laughter, capturing both Sarah's disbelief and her overwhelming joy. But the chapter also has a painful moment. Tension rises between Sarah and Hagar, and eventually Abraham is urged to send Hagar and Ishmael away. It's a heartbreaking situation, especially for Hagar, who finds herself wandering in the wilderness with her son, convinced they won't survive. Yet God meets her there, just as he did before. He hears Ishmael's cries, promises to make him into a great nation, and provides water in the desert. Meanwhile, Isaac grows, Abraham makes a peace treaty with Abimelech, and life moves forward. Genesis 21 shows that God keeps his promises to Isaac through the covenant and to Ishmael through compassion. Joy and hardship run side by side, but God is present in both, guiding every part of the story. Genesis 22 is one of the most intense and unforgettable moments in the Bible. God tests Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, the very child through whom every promise was supposed to come. It's a request that feels impossible, yet Abraham moves forward in obedience, trusting that God can still fulfill his word, even if he doesn't understand how. As father and son climb the mountain together, Isaac notices the fire and the wood, but asks where the lamb is for the offering. Abraham answers with quiet faith, God himself will provide. And just as Abraham raises the knife, God intervenes. A voice from heaven stops him, affirming his faith, and a ram caught in a thicket becomes the substitute sacrifice. Abraham names the place, "The Lord will provide," a reminder that God's faithfulness never depends on human understanding. Genesis 22 reveals the depth of Abraham's trust and the heart of God's mercy. He doesn't ask for Isaac's life, but he does provide a life in his place. It's a chapter that echoes throughout the rest of Scripture, pointing to a future moment when God will provide on another mountain once and for all. Genesis 23 is a quiet but significant chapter. Sarah, Abraham's lifelong companion and the mother of the promised son, dies at 127 years old. Her death marks the passing of a major part of Abraham's journey. Everything they walked through together, from leaving their homeland to witnessing God's promises unfold, Abraham mourns deeply, showing the very human side of grief. But he also takes an important step of faith. He negotiates with the local Hittites to buy a burial field and a cave in the land of Canaan. It's the first piece of the promised land he actually owns, not as a gift, but as a permanent possession. This small plot becomes a quiet anchor to God's promise that the land would one day belong to his descendants. Genesis 23 may seem simple, but it shows Abraham's trust in God even in sorrow. By burying Sarah in the promised land, he expresses confidence that God's word will outlast both grief and generations. Genesis 24 is one of the Bible's most beautiful stories of guidance and providence. Abraham, now advanced in years, wants to ensure that Isaac marries someone who will share in the covenant God established, so he sends his servant on a long journey back to his homeland to find a wife. Not just any wife, but the right one. The servant prays for God's direction, asking for a clear sign, and before he even finishes praying, Rebekah appears. Her kindness, generosity, and willingness to help reveal her character immediately. Everything unfolds with a sense of divine timing. From her drawing water to learning Isaac's family connection to her family agreeing to the marriage. When Rebekah finally arrives back in Canaan, Isaac meets her, and their union brings comfort after the loss of his mother. Genesis 24 shows that God is not distant from the details of our lives. He guides, provides, and weaves ordinary moments into his larger story. Rebekah's arrival isn't just a marriage, it's the continuation of the covenant line that will shape the future of God's people. Genesis 25 marks both an ending and a beginning. Abraham, the father of the covenant, reaches the end of his long life. He dies at 175 years old and is buried beside Sarah, closing a chapter that shaped everything that came after him. But the story doesn't slow down. Attention turns to the next generation, to Isaac and his twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Even before they're born, the twins struggle in the womb, and God tells Rebekah that two nations are growing inside her, one stronger, one serving the other. When they finally arrive, Esau comes first, rough and rugged, while Jacob follows, grasping his brother's heel, hinting at the tension to come as they grow. Their differences only sharpen. Esau becomes a hunter, Jacob a quieter man who stays near home. Then comes the defining moment. Esau, exhausted and driven by hunger, trades his birthright, the family's spiritual inheritance, for a simple bowl of stew. It seems impulsive, almost casual, but it shows how differently the brothers value the things of God. Genesis 25 is a turning point, showing that God's promises will continue, but not through the son people might expect. The covenant story moves forward through unexpected choices and surprising people. Genesis 26 gives a rare spotlight to Isaac, and his story feels like a reflection of Abraham's. A famine strikes the land, and Isaac faces the same kind of uncertainty his father did. God appears to him and tells him not to go to Egypt, but to stay where he leads, promising the same covenant blessings he gave Abraham: land, descendants, and a future that will bless the nations. Isaac settles among the Philistines, but fear gets the best of him, and he repeats his father's old mistake by calling Rebekah his sister. Yet even through Isaac's flaws, God protects them and continues to bless his household. Conflicts arise over wells, showing the tension between Isaac's growing influence and the locals, but Isaac chooses peace each time. moving on rather than fighting. Eventually, even his rivals recognize that God is with him. God appears again to reaffirm the promise, and Isaac responds by building an altar and calling on the Lord's name. Genesis 26 reminds us that God's faithfulness doesn't depend on perfect people. It continues from generation to generation, even through familiar struggles and repeated mistakes. Genesis 27 is one of the most dramatic moments in the family story. Isaac, now old and nearly blind, prepares to give his blessing to Esau, the firstborn. But Rebekah overhears and remembers God's earlier words, that the older would serve the younger. She and Jacob devise a risky plan. Jacob disguises himself as Esau to receive the blessing instead. The scene is tense and emotional. Isaac hesitates, confused by the voice he hears and the hands he touches, but Jacob presses forward, and Isaac ultimately blesses him with the family's spiritual inheritance, the promise of land, descendants, and God's favor. When Esau returns and the truth comes out, his grief turns into rage. The consequences are immediate. Esau vows to kill Jacob, and Jacob is forced to flee for his life. Genesis 27 shows a family tangled in fear, favoritism, and deception. Yet even through the mess, God's plan moves forward. The blessing falls on Jacob, not because he manipulates his way into it, but because God had chosen him long before. It's a chapter that shows both the cost of deception and the unstoppable nature of God's promise. Genesis 28 follows Jacob right as he's fleeing from Esau's anger. He leaves home with nothing but his staff, stepping into an uncertain future. One night, while sleeping in the open with a stone for a pillow, Jacob has a dream that changes everything. He sees a staircase reaching from earth to heaven with angels going up and down, and God standing above it. In this moment, God speaks directly to Jacob, confirming the same covenant he made with Abraham and Isaac. The land will be his descendants will be countless, and through his family, the world will be blessed. But God also gives Jacob something deeply personal, a promise of presence and protection. I am with you, God says, and I will not leave you. When Jacob wakes up, he's overwhelmed. He realizes he's encountered God in a place he never expected. He sets up a stone marker, names the place Bethel, and commits himself to God's guidance. Genesis 28 shows that even when life feels unstable or uncertain, God meets us right where we are and walks with us into the future. Genesis 29 feels like the beginning of a new chapter in Jacob's life. After a long journey, he arrives at a well in his relative's region and meets Rachel, the woman who will capture his heart instantly. Moved by both hospitality and hope, Jacob begins working for her father, Laban, and agrees to serve 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. The years pass quickly because of how deeply he loves her, but on the wedding night, everything takes a shocking turn. Laban deceives Jacob, secretly giving him his older daughter Leah. Instead, Jacob only discovers the truth the next morning. It's a painful twist. Jacob, the deceiver, is now deceived. Laban offers Rachel as well, but only after another 7 years of service, Jacob agrees, and suddenly he finds himself with 2 wives, complicated relationships, and the seeds of rivalry that will shape the future of his family. Genesis 29 shows how God's plans continue even through human trickery and emotional complexity. Love, disappointment, and unexpected turns fill this chapter, yet God is quietly building the family that will become the 12 tribes of Israel. Genesis 30 is a chapter filled with family tension and unexpected blessings. The rivalry between Leah and Rachel intensifies as both women long for children, and their competition spills over into every part of household life. They each give their servants to Jacob as additional wives, hoping to gain an advantage through more children. The result is a growing and complicated family, one that will eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. In the middle of this emotional chaos, God continues to work. He listens to the cries of both women, and he opens the wombs of those who were previously unable to have children. Jacob's family expands, not because human plans are perfect, but because God is faithful to his promise. Meanwhile, Jacob's flocks also grow through a strange and clever breeding strategy that leaves him prosperous, while Laban's flocks diminish. Genesis 30 shows that even in messy human situations, God's purpose moves forward. He brings life, growth, and blessing where no one else expects it. Genesis 31 builds toward a long overdue separation. After years of working under Laban's shifting and often unfair treatment, Jacob realizes it's time to return home. God appears to him and confirms that he will be with him on the journey back. Jacob gathers his family and possessions and leaves quietly, but Laban soon discovers their departure and chases after them. The confrontation that follows is tense, filled with accusations and defensiveness, yet God intervenes again, appearing to Laban in a dream and warning him not to harm Jacob. When they finally meet, they air their frustrations but avoid violence. Instead, they set up a stone pillar and form a covenant at Mizpah, agreeing to keep peace and respect one another's boundaries. It's a moment of closure after years of mistrust. Genesis 31 shows that God protects his people even when they're caught between hostility behind them and uncertainty ahead. Jacob leaves not in fear but in confidence that God is guiding his steps back toward the land of promise. Genesis 32 is one of the most transformative nights in Jacob's life. After years away, Jacob is finally heading home. But that also means facing Esau, the brother he deceived and fled from fear, rises as Jacob hears Esau is approaching with 400 men. Unsure of what awaits him, Jacob prays honestly, sends gifts ahead as a gesture of peace, and prepares for the worst. But the real turning point comes at night when Jacob finds himself alone and a mysterious man begins to wrestle with him until daybreak. The struggle is intense, physical, and symbolic. Jacob refuses to let go until he receives a blessing, and in that moment, the man reveals his divine identity. He gives Jacob a new name, Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. It marks the shift in Jacob's life from grasping and scheming to trusting and surrendering. Genesis 32 shows that before Jacob can face his brother, he must first be changed by God. And that change comes through honest struggle, not perfect strength. Genesis 33 brings a surprising and emotional resolution. After all the fear and anticipation, Jacob finally meets Esau face to face. Instead of anger or revenge, Esau runs to Jacob, embraces him, and weeps. What Jacob expected to be a moment of judgment becomes a moment of grace. The past isn't erased, but it is forgiven. Jacob, humbled and relieved, responds with respect and gratitude, insisting that Esau take his gifts as a sign of peace. The brothers go their separate ways peacefully, and Jacob arrives safely in the land God promised, settling near Shechem and building an altar to honor God's faithfulness. Genesis 33 shows that reconciliation, when it happens, is a gift only God can truly orchestrate. The brother Jacob feared the most becomes a vessel of unexpected kindness, reminding us that God can heal even the deepest wounds in the human story. Genesis 34 is a painful and complicated chapter. Dinah, the daughter of Jacob and Leah, is taken and mistreated by Shechem, a local prince. Afterward, Shechem tries to make things right in his own way. He wants to marry her and is willing to offer anything to Jacob's family. But the damage has been done, and the emotions within Jacob's sons run deep. Simeon and Levi craft a plan that looks like reconciliation on the surface, but underneath it's driven by anger and a desire for revenge. They convince the men of the city to undergo circumcision as a condition for peace, and while the men are in pain, Simeon and Levi attack, killing them all. Jacob is horrified by the violence, fearing the consequences it will bring on his household. Genesis 34 doesn't offer simple solutions. It shows how human pain, injustice, and unchecked anger can spiral into even greater tragedy. It's a reminder that not every action taken in the name of honor reflects the heart of God. Genesis 35 brings Jacob back to the place where he first encountered God. After the chaos surrounding Dinah's story, God tells Jacob to return to Bethel and build an altar there. Jacob prepares his household, puts away foreign idols, and leads his family in worship as they move toward the place where his journey with God began. At Bethel, God appears to Jacob again, reaffirming the covenant and the new name he gave him, Israel. God repeats the promises of descendants, land, and a lasting nation, reminding Jacob that his plan is still moving forward. But the chapter also carries deep sorrow. On the road from Bethel, Rachel goes into difficult labor and dies giving birth to Benjamin, leaving Jacob heartbroken. Not long after, Isaac also dies at a ripe old age, and Jacob and Esau reunite to bury their father. Genesis 35 is a chapter of renewal and loss, sacred moments tied together with human grief. Through it all, God remains present, guiding Jacob through both the blessings and the heartbreaks that shape his family's future. Genesis 36 shifts the focus away from Jacob's family to trace the descendants of his brother Esau. It's a detailed genealogy, but it serves an important purpose. Esau's line grows into the nation of Edom, one of Israel's major neighbors and, at times, rivals. The chapter lists chiefs and rulers who rise from his family, showing how quickly Esau's descendants become a structured and influential people. While Jacob's family is still small and struggling, Esau's becomes powerful and established. Genesis 36 reminds the reader that God's promises to Abraham's family don't mean other nations won't flourish too. Edom has its own story, its own land, and its own leaders. And even though the covenant will continue through Jacob's line, Esau's legacy shapes the landscape of the ancient world. Genesis 37 marks the beginning of one of the Bible's most compelling stories. Joseph, Jacob's favored son, stands out from his brothers, not just because of the special robe his father gives him, but because of the dreams he starts having. In these dreams, his brothers bow before him, and even his parents seem to take a lesser place. Joseph doesn't keep these dreams quiet, and jealousy begins to burn in his brothers' hearts. One day, when Joseph goes to check on them in the fields, their resentment finally boils over. They seize him, strip him of his robe, and debate killing him. Instead, they sell him to passing traders who carry him off to Egypt. They return home with a story that convinces Jacob that his beloved son is dead. The chapter ends with Joseph forced into a foreign land, while his family believes he's gone forever. Genesis 37 shows how jealousy and favoritism can tear a family apart, but it also sets the stage for a much bigger plan. What looks like tragedy is actually the beginning of God's work behind the scenes. Genesis 38 is an unexpected detour from Joseph's story, but it plays a crucial role in the bigger picture. Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, leaves his family and builds a life among the Canaanites. His sons make poor choices and face serious consequences, leaving Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, abandoned and mistreated. When Judah fails to keep his promises to her, Tamar takes matters into her own hands through a bold and surprising plan. Though the situation is messy and uncomfortable, the outcome shifts everything. When Judah realizes what has happened, he admits that Tamar acted more righteously than he did. Their son, Perez, becomes part of the very family line through which the future Messiah will come. Genesis 38 shows that God's purposes move forward even through deeply flawed people. What seems like a scandal becomes a key moment in preserving the lineage that will eventually lead to Jesus. Genesis 39 returns to Joseph's journey in Egypt, and it becomes clear that even far from home, God is with him. Sold to an Egyptian official named Potiphar, Joseph works with honesty and skill, quickly rising to a position of trust. Everything in the household thrives under his care. But when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, Joseph refuses, choosing integrity over temptation, even though it costs him everything she falsely accuses him, and Joseph is thrown into prison. Yet even there, God's presence doesn't leave him. Joseph once again rises to responsibility, earning the respect of the prison keeper and helping manage the entire facility. Genesis 39 shows that faithfulness doesn't always lead to immediate reward, but God sees, God knows, and God remains close. Joseph's circumstances change, but his character stays steady, and God's purpose continues to unfold through his life, even behind bars. Genesis 40 keeps Joseph in a difficult place, but it also shows how his God-given gifts continue to shine, even in prison. 2 new prisoners arrive, the king's cupbearer and his baker, each troubled by a dream they can't understand. Joseph notices their distress and reminds them that interpretations belong to God, not to him. When they share their dreams, Joseph explains exactly what they mean. The cupbearer will be restored to his position, while the baker will be executed. Everything unfolds precisely as Joseph said. Joseph asks the cupbearer to remember him and speak to Pharaoh on his behalf, but once the cupbearer returns to the palace, he forgets. The chapter ends with Joseph still waiting in prison, faithful but unseen. Genesis 40 highlights an important truth. Even when people forget, God doesn't. Joseph's gift is preparing the way for something far bigger than he realizes. Genesis 41 is Joseph's turning point, one that comes suddenly after years of silence. Pharaoh has 2 disturbing dreams, and none of his advisors can explain them. Only then does the cupbearer finally remember Joseph. Brought out of prison, Joseph stands before Pharaoh and makes it clear that interpretations come from God, not from him. He explains that both dreams carry the same message. 7 years of abundance are coming, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph then suggests a wise plan. Store grain during the good years so the nation can survive the hard ones. Pharaoh recognizes Joseph's wisdom and the presence of God in his life, and he elevates him to the highest position in Egypt under the king himself. Joseph goes from prisoner to prime minister in a single day. As the famine spreads, people from all nations come to Egypt for food, placing Joseph at the center of God's unfolding story. Genesis 41 shows how God can take years of waiting, hardship, and obscurity and use them to prepare someone for a moment that changes everything. Genesis 42 begins the moment Joseph's early dreams start coming true. The famine spreads across the region, and Jacob sends 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain, never imagining that the man in charge is the son he believes is dead. When the brothers stand before Joseph, they don't recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them immediately. It's a powerful moment, filled with emotion. Joseph keeps hidden. He tests them, not out of revenge, but to see whether their hearts have changed. He accuses them of being spies, holds Simeon hostage, and demands they return with Benjamin, the youngest brother. As the brothers leave, old guilt comes crashing back. They remember what they did to Joseph and see their hardship as judgment for their past. Back at home, Jacob resists sending Benjamin, terrified of losing another son. Genesis 42 shows that the past doesn't stay buried forever. The brothers' journey to Egypt forces old sins, old wounds, and old fears back into the open, setting the stage for healing that none of them can see yet. Genesis 43 deepens the tension and reveals Joseph's heart in unexpected ways. The famine grows worse, and Jacob reluctantly agrees to send Benjamin to Egypt, trusting Judah's promise to protect him. When the brothers return and Joseph sees Benjamin, he is overwhelmed, so much so that he has to leave the room to weep in private. But instead of revealing his identity, Joseph continues to test them through kindness. He prepares a lavish meal for them, seats them in birth order, which leaves them stunned, and gives Benjamin portions far bigger than the others. The brothers don't know what to make of this mysterious hospitality. Is it favor? Suspicion? Something else entirely? What Joseph is really watching for is how they treat Benjamin, the favored brother, now placed in a position similar to the one Joseph once held. Genesis 43 shows a family on the edge of transformation. Joseph's generosity is not a game. It's a gentle, strategic way of uncovering who his brothers have become and whether reconciliation is truly possible. Genesis 44 brings Joseph's testing of his brothers to its most intense moment. After the meal, Joseph secretly places his silver cup in Benjamin's sack and sends the brothers on their way. Then he has them chased down and accused of theft. When the cup is found with Benjamin, it feels like the past repeating itself. Another favored son in danger, Joseph declares that Benjamin must stay in Egypt as his servant, while the others may go free. This is the moment Joseph has been waiting for. Will they abandon Benjamin the way they abandoned him? But Judah steps forward with a powerful plea. He explains how losing Benjamin would destroy their father and offers himself in Benjamin's place. Judah's words reveal a completely transformed heart, one willing to sacrifice for the sake of family. Genesis 44 shows that the brothers are no longer the men they once were. The test exposes not guilt, but growth, proving that reconciliation is not only possible, but ready to bloom. Genesis 45 is one of the most emotional chapters in Genesis. Once Judah offers himself, Joseph can't hold back any longer. He sends everyone out except his brothers and breaks down in tears, revealing who he truly is. I am Joseph. Shock and fear sweep over them. They once betrayed him, and now he holds all the power. But Joseph doesn't respond with anger. He responds with grace. He tells them not to be afraid or ashamed because God used their actions, even their wrongdoing, to save lives during the famine. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Joseph embraces them, forgives them completely, and invites the entire family to come live in Egypt, where they will be provided for. Genesis 45 shows the beauty of forgiveness rooted in faith. Joseph sees God's hand in every twist of his story, and because of that, he can offer mercy instead of revenge. It's a chapter where healing replaces hurt, and God's purpose shines through human brokenness. Genesis 46 marks a major turning point for Jacob and his family. After learning that Joseph is alive, Jacob prepares to leave the land God promised to his ancestors and move to Egypt, a foreign place with an uncertain future. Before he goes, Jacob stops at Beersheba to offer sacrifices, seeking God's guidance. God speaks to him in a vision, reassuring him that this move is not a step away from the promise, but a step toward its unfolding. God promises to go with him, multiply his family there, and eventually bring them back to the land of Canaan. Strengthened by this assurance, Jacob continues the journey with his entire family, sons, grandchildren, servants, and all their belongings. When Jacob finally meets Joseph again, the reunion is tender and emotional, the relief of years of sorrow melting into joy. Genesis 46 shows that even big, uncertain transitions are held in God's hands. Moving to Egypt isn't a detour. It's part of God's bigger plan to grow Israel into a great nation. Genesis 47 shows Joseph's wisdom shaping the future of both Egypt and his own family. Pharaoh welcomes Jacob's household with generosity, giving them the region of Goshen, a fertile area where they can thrive. Jacob blesses Pharaoh, hinting at the spiritual significance of this unlikely meeting between a shepherd patriarch and the king of Egypt. Meanwhile, Joseph manages the ongoing famine with skill, keeping Egypt alive during years of hardship. People sell their livestock and land to Pharaoh in exchange for food, and Joseph structures a system that stabilizes the nation while ensuring survival. Throughout it all, Israel's family grows and prospers in their new home, positioned exactly where God told Jacob they would be safe. Genesis 47 highlights Joseph's leadership, Pharaoh's favor, and God's quiet provision. A family once broken and scattered is now protected and flourishing even in a foreign land. Genesis 48 shows Jacob near the end of his life, extending the covenant blessing to the next generation. Joseph brings his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to see their grandfather. These boys were born in Egypt, far from the land of promise, but Jacob adopts them as his own, giving them a full share in Israel's future. Joseph positions the older son, Manasseh, at Jacob's right hand, expecting the traditional blessing to go to him, but Jacob crosses his hands, placing his right hand on Ephraim. Instead, Joseph tries to correct him, but Jacob refuses. He knows what he's doing. The younger son will rise above the older, a pattern God has used many times before Jacob blesses them both abundantly, declaring that God, who shepherded him all his life, will be with them too. Genesis 48 reveals that God's purposes don't always follow human expectations. The blessing moves forward not through tradition, but through God's choosing, reminding us that his plans often unfold in surprising ways. Genesis 49 is Jacob's final speech, a poetic, prophetic blessing spoken over each of his 12 sons. Some blessings reflect the sons' past actions. Others point to their future roles as tribes of Israel. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi face consequences for earlier sins, losing positions they might have held. But when Jacob reaches Judah, the tone shifts. Judah receives a royal promise, leadership, strength, and a future kingly line. Jacob declares that the scepter will not depart from Judah, hinting at a dynasty that will one day bring forth the ultimate ruler. The other tribes receive unique descriptions: Zebulun's seafaring connections, Issachar's strength, Dan's leadership, Gad's resilience, Asher's abundance, Naphtali's freedom, Joseph's fruitfulness, and Benjamin's fierce spirit. After blessing them, Jacob gives instructions for his burial in the family tomb, alongside Abraham and Isaac. Genesis 49 shows that the story of Israel is bigger than any single moment. Each son becomes a tribe, and each tribe plays a role. But the hope of a future king runs straight through Judah, a thread that will lead all the way to the Messiah. Genesis 50 brings the book of Genesis to a gentle but powerful close. After Jacob dies, Joseph leads a heartfelt funeral procession to Canaan to bury his father in the family tomb, fulfilling Jacob's final request and honoring the legacy of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel himself. When they return to Egypt, Joseph's brothers begin to fear that he might finally take revenge for what they did to him years earlier. They send a message begging for forgiveness, unsure of how Joseph truly feels. But Joseph responds with grace that's both disarming and deeply comforting. He weeps, assures them he holds no grudge, and speaks one of the most important lines in the entire Bible: "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph recognizes that even through betrayal, slavery, and hardship, God was working behind the scenes to bring life and rescue to many people during the famine. The chapter ends with Joseph's death, but not his despair. He makes his family promise to carry his bones back to the promised land. One day, Genesis 50 reminds us that God can take human brokenness, twist it toward redemption, and write a story far greater than the pain that came before. Genesis isn't just the first book of the Bible, it's the foundation of everything that follows. Across 50 chapters, we watch the world go from perfect beauty to heartbreaking brokenness, and then to the slow, steady unfolding of God's plan to restore what was lost. We see creation spoken into existence, relationships shattered, and nations begin to form. We walk through stories of faith and failure, jealousy and forgiveness, judgment and mercy. And through every moment, whether it's the flood, the calling of Abraham, the wrestling of Jacob, or the rise of Joseph, one truth remains unshaken: God is at work, moving history toward hope. Genesis shows us who God is: powerful in creation, patient with humanity, and faithful to his promises. It shows us who we are: people capable of both incredible good and heartbreaking evil, yet never beyond the reach of grace. And it points forward to a Redeemer who will one day crush the serpent, carry the blessing of Abraham to the nations, and turn evil into good in ways far greater than Joseph ever imagined. So as you step out of Genesis and into the rest of Scripture, remember, this isn't just ancient history. It's the beginning of a story we're still living in, a story of a God who forms, rescues, renews, and redeems. And every chapter, from the first breath of creation to the final word of Revelation, pulls us deeper into his purpose. Genesis isn't just where the Bible starts, it's where the promise starts. And that promise is still unfolding today.